Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on this wet night. My name's Peter May, and it's been my privilege to chair the committee that has organised this 10 days of lectures and debates with William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig is Research Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in California. He's got doctorates in philosophy and theology. His first doctorate on the Kalam cosmological argument was earned under Professor Hick at Birmingham University. And that argument is now the most widely discussed argument on the existence of God in contemporary Western philosophy. And that in itself is a very good reason why Richard Dawkins should accept the challenge tomorrow and turn up and debate him in Oxford. Dr. Craig went on to do a second doctorate, this time in theology, on the historicity of the resurrection of Christ under Wolfhard Pannenberg in Munich. Dr. Craig's the author of some 30 books and some 200 academic papers published in peer-reviewed journals. So what about tonight? Where does the historicity of Jesus' resurrection fit into a program of debates and lectures? Well, in 2007, when Dr. Craig last visited the UK, he lectured on the absurdity of life without God, the evidence for Jesus, the identity of Jesus, looking at his claims and self-perception, and also the problem of suffering. Now, all these lectures can be downloaded from our Be Thinking website. If you're not good at reading things on the side, that's what that upside-down word means, which is a valuable resource for this material. So this tour, he will have lectured on the evidence for God, the moral argument for God, the specific arguments put forward by two of the most famous atheist scientists, and now tonight he will address the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. I was in my late teens when I first read the New Testament. I did it because I had Christian friends and I thought the matter needed attention. I wanted to make a decision about it. I didn't want this thing just to sort of dog me. I wanted to read it, come to a conclusion, and work it out from there. So I read it very slowly. I took just a chapter a night. I knew, because I was enormously well informed in those teenage years, as all teenagers are, that dead men stay dead. And that's obvious. And so when I read about the resurrection, I somehow managed to skip over it without much notice. This obviously was a bizarre sort of business. At the end of 9 months, however, when I got a grasp of the scope of where the New Testament ran, I felt I just had to go through it again. It didn't click. I couldn't put the pieces together. So I went through it a second time. This time, the centrality of the resurrection just leapt out. It was obvious and unavoidable. And I came to see that the whole case for Christianity stood or fell on this issue. And yet everyone knows that dead people stay dead. And so I ended up doing it a third time, taking a chapter a night in order to focus specifically on the resurrection. And somewhere in that year, I had a eureka moment. It was not that I came to believe it. I was still a very long way from that. But I saw something in a moment of realization that changed the game for me. It was like that realization you get when you've left the house and you close the door behind you and you're halfway down the garden path and you get that warm feeling that comes up from below as you realize you've left the key inside. And now my realization was this, that whatever the facts of the matter, whatever the truth actually was, the disciples, anyway, passionately believed it was true. There could be no disputing it. They were not only passionate about what they were claiming, but they were enormously brave. They traveled vast distances, faced tremendous opposition, and proclaimed with great vigor that Christ had been raised from the dead. They were irrepressible, and many of them paid for it with their lives. Now, lies turn men into cowards and not heroes. Yet these men took the world by storm, and their passionate conviction about the resurrection carried everything before it, so that within a generation, The church and the Christian message were spreading into Asia, Africa, and Europe at a tremendous rate. Why did the realization that the disciples really believed it change the nature of the question? Because suddenly I could leave aside all those theories which implied deliberate or intentional fraud or deception. And now I could focus on what sort of events could have resulted in such a burning conviction in so many people. As Professor Charlie Mull, who was a famous New Testament scholar, said on the radio towards the end of his life, I listened to a fascinating discussion with the old man, he said, "You've got to find a launching pad to launch this missile." And now, in order to help us all think through the historical possibilities of 2,000 years ago and to find such a launching pad, I'm delighted to introduce you to William Lane Craig.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's a delight to be in Southampton this evening, to be back in the UK. On Sunday, we went with Peter and Heather down to the docks, and there was the great Queen Elizabeth moored, and it brought back memories, because when Jan and I first came to England to do my doctoral studies in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, the place that we arrived in England was Southampton, aboard the QE2. And so it brought back all those memories of being here in 1975 and the wonderful years that we spent in this country and how much we enjoy coming back. And so I'm grateful that you've come this evening and that I've been given the opportunity to speak on this most important subject of the resurrection of Jesus. A few years ago, I was speaking on a major Canadian university campus on the evidence for the existence of God. And one slightly irate student wrote on her comment card, turned in afterwards, "I was with you until you got to the stuff about Jesus. God is not the Christian God." Now, this attitude is all too typical today. I find that most people are happy to agree that God exists, but it's become politically incorrect to claim that God has decisively revealed himself in Jesus. What justification can Christians offer, as opposed to Muslims or Jews or Hindus or others, for thinking that the Christian God is real? Well, the answer of the New Testament to that question is clear: the resurrection of Jesus. The apostles proclaimed, and I quote, "God will judge the world by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." Acts chapter 17 and verse 31. The resurrection is God's public vindication of Jesus' radical personal claims to be the absolute revelation of God. So, how do we know that Jesus is risen from the dead? There's an Easter hymn that says, "You ask me how I know he lives within my heart." Now, I think that on a personal level, this answer is perfectly legitimate. But when it comes to engaging in a conversation in the public square, or in letters to the editor, or in conversation with co-workers, then I think it's critical that Christians be able to present objective evidence in support of our beliefs. Otherwise, our claims hold no more credibility than the assertions of anyone else who claims to have a private religious experience. Fortunately, Christianity is peculiar in that it is a religion which is rooted in historical events. It makes claims which can therefore be investigated historically. Suppose then that this evening we agree to approach the documents of the New Testament not as inspired holy books, but rather simply as a collection of documents written in the Greek language, handed down out of the first century, telling this remarkable story about this man, Jesus of Nazareth, without any assumption whatsoever as to their reliability, the same way we would approach other ancient documents for history. You might be surprised to learn that when ancient historians approach the New Testament documents with this attitude, that the majority of scholars today accept the central facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to emphasize that I'm not talking here about conservative scholars or evangelical scholars. Rather, I'm talking about the broad mainstream of critical, historical, New Testament scholarship today. The work that is done by professors who teach at secular universities and non-evangelical theological colleges. Amazing as it may seem, most of them have come to agree with the historicity of the central facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus. And these are listed on your handout for your convenience. These facts are 4 in number. Fact number 1, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Now, this fact is important because it means, contrary to the claims of radical critics like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, that the location of Jesus' burial site was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike. This fact is highly significant because the disciples could never have proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus in Jerusalem in the face of a tomb containing his corpse. New Testament scholars have established this fact on the basis of evidence such as the following 4 points, which I shall highlight. Number 1, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old tradition which is handed on by Paul in his first letter to the church in Corinth, Greece. In chapter 15, verses 3 to 5, Paul writes as follows: "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." And then comes this 4-line formula: that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, it's the Aramaic word for Peter, and then to the 12. Paul uses here not only the technical rabbinical terms for received and delivered with regard to the information that he's passing on to the Corinthians, but verses 3 to 5 are a highly stylized 4-line formula which is replete with non-Pauline characteristics. This has convinced all scholars that Paul is, just as he says, quoting from an old tradition which he himself received and then in turn passed on to his converts in Corinth. This tradition probably goes back at least to Paul's fact-finding journey to Jerusalem around AD 36, when he spent 2 weeks with Peter and with James in Jerusalem. Now, when you recall that Jesus was crucified around AD 30, that means that this information goes back to within the first 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion.